Is free speech in the online world fundamentally different to the offline world?
I would argue a hard no. I think online speech should be as free as speech in the analog world, and I don't see it as a more of a social media post as being more of a threat than someone writing something on paper or speaking out on the street.
Hi there, my name is Justin Stairs. This is the Brussels Signal Studio, and we have an online guest, a remote guest for you today. His name is Jacob Mchangama, and he is a human rights advocate and executive director of the Future of Free Speech, which is his own non-partisan organization, and also research professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville in the US. Hello there, Jacob.
Hello.
And welcome. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, free speech, it's kind of like a big issue with a lot of political implications. I thought maybe we could start with the wider issues before focusing on Europe. My first question for you is the definition, is the concept of free speech changing in the online world? I know in some of your past interviews you have said stuff like there's nothing new under the sun, but is free speech in the online world fundamentally different to the offline world?
I in the sense of, should there be further restrictions on online free speech? I would argue a hard no. In fact, I think that to a certain extent, states are adopting more rigid regulations to try and control online speech than they're doing in the analog world. So, I think online speech should be as free as speech in the analog world, and I don't see it as a more of a threat. I don't see a social media post as being more of a threat than someone writing something on paper or speaking out on the street. Or
I guess I asked that question because in the online world, is it not true that misinformation or whatever kind of information, even correct information or propaganda, whatever you want to call it, it does spread faster and perhaps has quicker, if not more serious consequences? Is that not a difference?
no, there can be a difference in scale, obviously, but if we start from the assumption that free speech is a fundamental right and that you need really strong reasons to justify restrictions, that also means that it's one of the things that we should celebrate about online speech, that you can actually communicate directly between, across borders, and that ordinary citizens have that opportunity that they didn't have before, where they would rely on institutional gatekeepers to have any say in the public sphere. So, I mean, that's a feature, not a bug of online speech. It's one of the things that I think is most important about it.
So there's no justification for new rules merely because we're talking about online free speech?
No, I mean, you could then say, the printing press is a new thing, so therefore it's justified with pre-publication censorship because we need to control what is being printed, because no one could have envisaged that you could spread heretical or illegal seditious ideas before, and therefore it's justified to have pre-publication censorship. That's an argument. I don't buy it. But there you go.
Well, it's one of the arguments you hear around here in Brussels, in fact. But let's come back to that in a minute. How about free speech absolutism? I mean, Does it exist is my first question, even in theory, because some people say to me, listen, people call themselves free speech absolutists, but it doesn't actually exist. You can't go, for example, if you are a nuclear scientist working on some kind of program in the US or in Europe or even elsewhere, you can't publish your plans or talk about them freely, can you? There are always certain limits
Yeah,
to
no,
free speech.
absolutely. Even here in the US, where the First Amendment protects categories of speech that are not protected in the European Union or in its member states, like hate speech. There are limits on free speech, on incitement to imminent violence, threats. Fraud is another category. No one would argue that fraud or embezzlement should be. It should be. You should have like a legitimate defense against being convicted for fraud by saying, "Hey, it's my free speech." So there are obviously a number of restrictions on free speech. What I think, if I was an absolutist on anything, it would be sort of viewpoint absolutism, in the sense that the government should not have the powers to discriminate between specific viewpoints and say, oh yes, you can be a socialist, but you can't be a fascist, or you can espouse these religious views, but not other religious views. But that is different from saying, if you espouse certain views in a way that are can lead to imminent harm, then those views can be restricted. But then that's not just because it's disfavored views; it's because you are, say, inciting to anti-Semitism or racist violence or the like.
Okay, so there are so free speech absolutism then is sort of
Yeah, I don't think any serious person really believes in free speech absolutism. Like I said, you can make an argument maybe of viewpoint absolutism, but that's different from free speech absolutism in my
okay.
book.
Okay. Now I know you're an author as well. You've written a history of free speech. It's called Free Speech: A History from Socrates to Social Media. And you touched already on the differences between the US and Europe. Can you go into a bit more detail, please, on these differences and where we are today?
Yeah. So the U.S. model has developed, especially in the second half of the 20th century, to become probably the most speech protective from a legal point of view in the world. So the test in the United States is a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio from 1969, which says that essentially the government can only punish speech if it reaches a threshold of incitement to imminent lawless action that is also likely to result in such outcomes. So that's a very high threshold. Essentially, these were Ku Klux Klan, KKK members who made sort of abstract threats against blacks and Jews. This would be something that would see you punished in every single member state of the European Union. It would also be a violation of the framework decision on countering racism and xenophobia, an EU instrument of EU law. But that is protected speech in the U.S. And the interesting thing about the U.S. is that in Europe, there's this idea that we need a militant democracy to avoid the horrors of Nazism. We need limits on free speech to protect minorities. But in the US, the groups that have fought for this kind of robust protections of free speech are minority groups. So it's Jewish groups, it's civil rights groups of blacks who recognize that in their fight against discrimination and oppression, free speech was their most important weapon, and that only a principled, consistent approach to free speech would make them secure. So, in other words, in the case of Brandenburg, it was a Jewish and a black lawyer for the ACLU who represented this KKK member. It was the first black Supreme Court justice, was one of the judges that, in a 9-0 decision, decided that this guy, obnoxious racist guy, could not be convicted for speech, for racist hate speech. Um, so that is, I think, is a big difference between Europe and the United States. And I think there's also this tendency in Europe that um, restrictions on hate speech has become almost an article of faith, and there's this tendency among member states and also in the EU to want to expand hate speech bans, extend it to more and more categories, and to essentially try to say every time there's a crisis, and especially in the digital era, we need soft law or hard law instruments to tackle it because speech is a problem and we need to do something about it. So I think Americans tend to see free speech as something that is much more important than Europe, where Europeans tend to say they have a balanced approach to free speech. Free speech is important, but it's not a value that supersedes other values. And there's this idea in Europe that free speech can conflict with equality and tolerance and so on. Whereas in America, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but the sort of leading view is that free speech and equality are values that are mutually reinforcing. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not in conflict.
Right. I'm wondering if this is true today and historically as well.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
no, like I said, and this is one of the reasons I think that Americans have adopted strong protections. Is because free speech was used systematically to deny minorities. So I live in the South. If you were here in the South during slavery, some states had the death penalty for spreading abolitionist ideas. So if you were to say in Alabama, if you were to spread literature that argued against slavery, you could go to prison. I don't think anyone was executed, but you could definitely be punished. And obviously, slaves had no rights whatsoever. You could kill them for saying whatever you wanted. But even during this, after slavery and the civil rights struggle, it was very common for southern states to use all kinds of restrictions on speech to try and subdue protest against racial segregation based on breach of the peace or defamation lawsuits against media organizations that wanted to shine a light on it. And so the response from the civil rights movement was to say we need free speech to be fully protected because that's our best way of countering this oppression. And we have Europe has chosen a different model, not I think not least because of the sort of the German approach to free speech and its reading of its own history, which says that you need a militant democracy to counteract the horrific history of Germany, in which Nazis came into power through democratic means and then abolished democracy and instituted a totalitarian regime that ultimately engaged in industrial scale genocide. And on the surface, that's a compelling argument. But what I look at in my book is I call this the Weimar fallacy. So basically, the argument that the Weimar Republic was this free speech haven is wrong. Nazis were frequently had their speech restricted. And even more dangerously, I think, is the fact that the very provisions in the Weimar Constitution and the Weimar Republic's laws that were supposed to protect democracy were ultimately used by the Nazis when they came into power to abolish democracy. So the Weimar Constitution, for instance, allowed the president to suspend all civil liberties, including free speech, in a time of emergency. And so this was the instrument that was used after the Reichstag fire in 1933. And that paved the way for the Nazis to then imprison, ban all their political opponents. And so I don't think the historical case is very strong for arguing that, the best remedy against totalitarianism is to ban those who espouse it. And it's also you have this double standard in the EU. So there's a very there are very strict bans on Nazism, right wing extremism, fascism, even symbols. The European Court of Human Rights will routinely throw out cases that challenge restrictions on Nazism and fascism. But in other cases, it has overturned bans against communist symbols and said that's a violation of free speech. But there's a large part of Europe which has their most recent experience with a totalitarian regime was communism. And you don't have to get into a competition between Nazism and communism, but they're both totalitarian regimes, and the death toll of communism ultimately was higher, also because it was in place for much longer than Nazism. And I don't think it makes sense to say, as the European Court of Human Rights has done, communism, Hungary, you can't ban communist symbols because democracy is now so strong that even though you have a recent past of living under a communist dictatorship, the right way to combat this is through democratic means. And then say to Germany and other countries, no, you absolutely not only are it's not only legitimate for you to crack down on Nazism and fascism and right wing extremism, but you may even have like a positive obligation to do so. That to me is quite incoherent, and I think that demonstrates the inherent problem with hate speech laws, that they reflect specific viewpoints of those who are in power, and they will then use those specific viewpoints. They will enforce them and define them, and then that will then reflect a specific outlook. And what I think we see increasingly is that these laws are being expanded to a degree that no one could have imagined. You can imagine, you can understand people in the immediate aftermath of World War II saying, yes, we need to be very, very careful. We don't want Nazi symbols after everything that happened. But today, it's the categories of speech that can be banned as hate speech has undergone scope creep beyond what I think most people would have imagined back then.
To hear you talk like that makes me wonder if restrictions on free speech actually work. I mean, has anyone actually studied this? Do they slow the spread of ideas?
That's a good question. So, and I think it's obviously extremely difficult to isolate. If you look at it from a social science perspective, how do you measure the specific consequences of speech? Well, we do actually have some studies that say that in Western Europe, for instance, those countries that are the most restrictive or most harsh on right-wing extremism experience more right-wing extremist violence than those who do less. This is a study from 2017 or 2018 by a Norwegian researcher. We also have studies that suggest that in democracies that restrict free speech experience more violence and social conflict than those that don't. And we have research that shows that people who in countries where speech is restricted, people are more likely to view using violence as being justified. So this is the sort of the pressure cooker theory, right?
Right.
If you can protest even the most obnoxious views, you have an opportunity to be heard. But if the government suppresses you, then you can, maybe convince yourself that using violence is justified because that's your only way of making change. And we also have some studies to suggest that, and this is, take the Netherlands. Geert Wilders is someone who has been twice, I think, prosecuted for anti-Muslim hate speech. I think he's been convicted once. And that what some studies have shown is that that has increased his support among people in the Netherlands who are critical of immigration, for instance. And in the last election in the Netherlands, his party became the biggest one in parliament. So that does not suggest to me that it's a very effective way
Hmm.
of, of, of cracking down on speech that you don't like. You could say the same thing with the AfD in Germany. Right now, they're polling higher than ever, but some of their leaders have been convicted for using Nazi-era slogans. And Germany, obviously, is a country that uh, is the most militant in Europe in terms of restricting free speech. But what if you look at the statistics of political extremism and violence, there's actually, I think, almost every year since 2018, there's been an increase of right wing extremist people, including people willing to use violence. So this is even after the NetzDG law was introduced in Germany, which was supposed to crack down on online hate speech. That did not seem to stop this phenomenon.
Also, you mentioned the so-called justification of emergency measures. So, in times of war, for example,
Yeah.
maybe governments would justify crackdowns on of all kinds, including crackdowns on free speech, because this is sort of happening now in Europe, is it not? I'm wondering if you could perhaps compare Europe to the US again, because here in Europe, for example, at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, when Russia invaded, one of the first decisions was to ban Russian state televisions such as RT. Are those
Yeah.
still available in the US?
Yes, they are. Um, I think they may have. I'm not sure on the details, but I think they may have designated RT as a foreign agent. But at least the initial decision from the commission was not only to revoke broadcasting licenses, but to send letters to Google and others saying you have to delist RT and Sputnik and whoever else was on the sanction list from your search results. Ensure that you can't share it on social media, that users can't do that. So that's extremely far-reaching. Um, and Josep Borrell, I think, who was the high representative at the time, defended this measure. He was saying essentially that this was not a restriction of free speech; this was a protection of freedom of expression, which I found, that was in and of itself an example of
Orwellian.
disinformation. Yeah. So this idea that the European Union can decide on behalf of the populations in 27 member states, most of which are among the most democratic and open in the world, that they should not be able for themselves to evaluate the content of state-sponsored Russian propaganda, I think is deeply concerning. Also because, in most member states, attitudes towards Russia are very negative, and in most member states, it's not like people are signing up to be Putinists. If you cannot, if you cannot in an open democracy with an educated citizenry trust citizens to reject um, state-sponsored propaganda from an authoritarian state, then essentially I think the whole basis for a free and open democracy falls aside, right? It's not like if I have access to RT and Sputnik, I also have access to all kinds of other ideas and information. Unlike in Russia, where censorship and propaganda is basically the only thing that's available. Citizens in Europe have all kinds of other sources of information that they can use to contrast with the narrative that is being fed by the Kremlin. And so I think, yeah, Orwellian is not a wrong way to describe the decision to ban state-sponsored. But the European Court of Justice upheld it. It saw this as a justified restriction on freedom of expression, saying it was essentially a temporary measure. But you have to remember the European Union and none of its member states are formally at war with Russia. So I can understand in Ukraine, Ukraine is a country at war. So you can understand if Ukraine says there have to be restrictions on media because we don't want the media to document troop movements and the like. That's a true emergency measure. You're at war. You're under attack. But the European Union, that's not the case.
Right.
Um,
Well, in fact, some people, I've had them in this studio who would argue that we are at war, but it is true that it's not officially, at least, it's not the case. As on the subject of EU legislation, you must have looked at the Digital Services Act, DMA, etc. I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah, so I mean, you look at the DSA; it has 18 references to freedom of expression, and it has some good things about transparency, some novel things about dispute resolutions, protecting user rights. But ultimately, I think a notice and takedown system spanning 27 member states with very different and often quite restrictive provisions on free speech is likely to result in over removal of content. And also, when you have the European Commission as a regulator for very large online platforms and search engines, and you have sort of very fuzzy provisions on systemic risk that I think is quite incompatible with freedom of expression, and at the very least creates a risk of the Commission using its powers to lean on platforms to remove content that is not illegal, but that it says, well, this is systemic risk. Maybe it would be a good idea for you to address it, and then the platforms say, okay, we'll address it, and we'll just block it, we'll remove it, we'll delete it.
So it's an over the top reaction.
Yeah, I think the first step actually would have been, if the DSA had focused on transparency, saying, okay, these platforms have such a huge influence on the public sphere in Europe. Um, we want a higher degree of transparency around how you operate. That would be that I think that would have been a good step, because then you could have had a period of, say, 2 or 3 years. Then once you had the transparency, you could have a more serious evaluation on the basis of, no, are the problems that we warned against really so obvious? Is it true that illegal hate speech is prevalent everywhere? Is mis and disinformation as big a problem as Ursula von der Leyen warns against? Transparency would allow you that, and then you could legislate on the basis of that. That, I think, would have allowed you to have a more targeted, less panicky approach to the online sphere than the DSA has resulted in.
We're drawing to the end of our time, but I wanted to tackle one other subject with you, and that is fact checkers. There are concerns expressed by governments and the European Commission and others that children and presumably adults as well need teaching, need instructing on ways to distinguish between correct information and disinformation, misinformation, etc. In fact, there are here in Europe, as you probably know, teams, companies who are subsidized by governments who do actually go around to schools and raise this problem among youngsters, teenagers, and even younger children. Um, is this a justified approach? And some of these, the lessons, the lectures they give, instruct the children to check if they see something, check if other publications or other serious publications are actually running the same news before they believe what they see. This is the kind of points they are making in these state-sponsored lectures. And then the fact checking is another obviously, which can be state funded as well. What do you think to this approach?
Well, on the one hand, you want children and citizens to be critical consumers of information and news. So encourage them to be critical and do fact checks. I think is something that you should encourage. The where it can become fuzzy is where you say if it's state sponsored and those entities then have a particular narrative where they define something as disinformation that is politicized. That's where it becomes problematic. That's actually why I'm in favor of the community nodes type of fact checking on platforms, because that takes the power away from sort of these appointed experts that even if they do a great job are likely to be distrusted, and puts it in, makes it much more decentralized in ways that is likely to increase trust without sacrificing accuracy. So I think that's a better way to think about it, than sort of some organization gets money from the commission to do fact checking, and then it comes with ideological strings attached.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if this is one of the fundamental differences between Europe and the US, the role of the state.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's you know Americans are inherently skeptical of the state getting involved in many things, not least speech, even though we have to say the current administration, the Trump administration, is repudiating um, the First Amendment and its basic fundamentals, and attacking it in very systematic ways. But sort of the traditional civil libertarian American approach to free speech is one that says that government cannot be trusted getting involved in these things. And I think in most European countries, there's not the same degree of skepticism. We have a higher degree of trust in the state being involved. And I think that is misguided when it comes to free expression.
That's great. Let's leave it there. Jacob, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And well, thanks very much for watching. The question at the end of that was, can you trust the government? Reminds me of a Pink Floyd song, actually. Thanks again for watching.